Welcome to Be Positively Powerful, Overcoming Trauma Through a Focus on Resilience and Empowerment. This is Video 1, Foundational Insight into Trauma and Resilience. There are 4 videos in this program: Foundational Insight into Trauma and Resilience, Be Positively Powerful Strategies to Increase Resilience, Educator Trauma and Secondary Traumatic Stress, and School-Wide Trauma-Informed Practices. My name is Nancy Willard. I'm a former special education teacher and former attorney and former education technology consultant. Currently, I am a researcher and consultant in the areas of trauma, bullying, harassment, and digital safety. In the hundreds, I wrote 3 books: Cyberbullying and Cyber Threats, Cyber Safe Kids and Cyber Savvy Teens, and Cyber Savvy. As you can see, I came into this environment through a focus on digital safety. My more recent books are Engage Students to Embrace Civility, Be Positively Powerful, A Guide for Teens on Achieving Resilience and Empowerment, Be Positively Powerful, Resilient When Things Get Tough, and the Spanish translation of this book. The underlying perspective of these 4 videos is that the global pandemic, together with increased racial unrest, is having a profoundly harmful impact on many students, families, and school staff. Therefore, all educators must have an understanding of how trauma and toxic stress impacts emotions, behavior, and lives, and must know how to assist students, families, peers, and themselves in being resilient when things get tough. These are my assumptions and my hope. My assumptions are that many students and their families have experienced and will continue to experience adversities. This includes both associated with the pandemic as well as the social unrest. And this is on top of the other adversities and trauma many students and their families have already experienced. All educators now have a very first-hand experience with trauma and toxic stress because of the pandemic. The harm from this trauma and toxic stress could be profound. However, within the studies of trauma, there is the concept of post-traumatic growth. And our hope can be that students, families, educators, and society could emerge from these challenges with a commitment to greater respect, kindness, and social justice. I have a strong focus on proceeding in a manner that is evidence-based. These are some of the very excellent resources I have relied on for the preparation of these materials: the CDC's work on preventing adverse childhood experiences, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, which focuses on resilience, CASEL, which focuses on social and emotional learning, the National Center for Safe and Supportive Learning Environments, SYNAPSES resources on trauma and trauma-informed approaches, and a new resource from ACE Aware, which is a California program. So, what is trauma? Trauma is an adverse experience that leaves one feeling helpless, hopeless, with fear for their own safety or the safety of loved ones. There are a number of different forms of trauma. There is acute trauma, a single exposure to an adverse event, like a shooting or a hurricane. Chronic trauma, trauma that is repeated on and different adverse events. For example, children who live in dangerous urban communities who have repeat exposure to shootings or violence. Toxic stress is longer lasting periods of adversity. And historical trauma is the cumulative adversity over the lifespan and across generations. What is resilience? Resilience has to be our focus. It's the ability to effectively respond when things get tough or bad things happen. It means bouncing back from difficult experiences, from the adversities that we may have occurred to us. It's feeling empowered even after something bad has happened. And being empowered is feeling strong and confident, getting past those adversities, learning from these experiences, and living a happy and successful life. The objective is like cultivating dandelions, to help young people gain greater dandelion-like qualities, the ability to grow and bloom anywhere. Dandelion-like qualities are the essence of resilience. There are a number of different ways that one can experience trauma. You can be the victim of the situation, a witness to the situation, have the situation occur to a loved one, or learn the details of someone else's trauma. The factors that contribute to the outcome of this adverse experience include the severity of the event, the individual's proximity to the event, the individual's prior history of trauma, their personal resilience characteristics, if it's a young person, their caregiver's reaction, and other family or community factors, and this includes culture, race, and ethnicity. What was the experience of young people of trauma before the pandemic? Over 50% of U.S. youth had experienced one or more types of serious trauma, and 33% had experienced two or more types of serious trauma. 16 million children live at or below the poverty line, and poverty definitely contributes to ongoing toxic stress. 15% of girls, 14 to 17, had experienced a sexual assault. 33% of students in inner city schools had witnessed a shooting or stabbing. And 33% of students experienced bullying. This comes from the National Survey of Children's Health in 2017. Also, pre-pandemic, groups who are at increased risk of exposure to trauma include youth of color, ages 12 to 19, actually extending beyond that, American African youth living in urban low-income communities, American Indian and Alaska Native youth and children, children and youth with disabilities, refugees, those who are homeless and living in poverty, and LGBTQ children and youth. To understand trauma, it's helpful to understand how key parts of the brain interact and interface with these toxic experiences. There's the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking center, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is our emotional regulation center, the hippocampus, which is where memory is stored, and the amygdala, the threat response center. So we all may, from time to time, experience a threat or an adversity. The healthy response to this is that the amygdala senses a threat of danger and triggers a body-wide response. Our cortisol, adrenaline, blood flow, respiration, pulse, and heart rate all go up. The hippocampus processes information about the threat based on past occurrences, which have been stored in this memory center. The anterior cingulate cortex regulates the individual's emotional response, and their prefrontal cortex allows for problem solving. The unhealthy response has been very effectively presented by Dan Siegel, who talks about how your brain functions kind of like a hand that is closed upon itself. But if you flip your lid, then your emotional and regulation and thinking centers become disconnected from the threat response and memory centers. So you are not able to regulate emotions and not able to engage in problem solving. The 4 common responses to adversity or threat are fight, aggression, outburst, disruption, yelling; flight, running away, refusing to talk, avoidance, substance abuse; freeze, becoming disconnected, stopping trying, being unresponsive; and fawn, avoiding conflict by appeasing others. The DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, characterizes the traumatic distress disorder with these aspects: re-experiencing, constant reliving events, having negative memories, flashbacks, and nightmares; avoidance, avoiding people and places that remind one of the adversity, emotional numbing, isolation, and withdrawal; negative cognitions, a persistent negative evaluation of self, others, and the world; hyperarousal, being easy to trigger, irritable, angry, having difficulties concentrating, and challenges with sleep; and distress and interference, headaches or stomach aches, and being unable to concentrate and learn. From the student perspective, I recommend thinking in terms of these 4 common traits: being hypervigilant, always focused on possible danger; lacking in self-regulation because their emotional regulation center is frequently disconnected; overreactive, bad memories that are stored in their hippocampus can cause an overreaction to situations that may not actually present current danger; and challenges in concentrating. Their thinking center is frequently disconnected, which reduces their ability to focus, concentrate, remember, and learn. I think, unfortunately, there's been an overemphasis on what is called mental illness, which is actually evidence of trauma symptoms. So if the symptoms of trauma are hypervigilance, anxiety, sadness, being detached, being overreacted, lacking in focus, suicidal, upset, irritable, outbursts, can't concentrate, and impulsive, should we consider the challenges that a child is experiencing to be trauma, or should we label them as having a mental illness like ADHD, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive? You can see all of these. I've done a lot of work in bullying prevention, and what really, really angers me is when I see so many situations where a student is being really abusively and continuously bullied at school, and the school is not doing anything to stop this. And then the child goes to a doctor, and that child is labeled as mentally ill and placed on psychotropic drugs because of the hurtful situation that needs to be stopped. And this simply is not okay. Further, we need to understand, and this isn't me talking, this is the American Academy of Pediatrics talking, that these psychotropic drugs have not established any effectiveness in use to address trauma in children. There is present no evidence to support the use of these psychotropic medications without first providing evidence-based psychotherapies in the treatment of pediatric PTSD. So, off my soapbox and back to the brain. We also have to understand within the brain the concept of neural synapses. Neurons form synapses to establish neural pathways in order to communicate and control how our body functions. What people have experienced in their lives has guided how their neural pathways have been established. If they've had basically positive experiences, that has supported the establishment of positive neural pathways. But if they've had a lot of negative experiences, that has supported the development of negative neural pathways. So the problem is that human brains developed with a focus on potential danger and risk. I mean, if you didn't pay attention to the fact there might be a cougar out there ready to attack you, you might not make it home, or you might make it to the cougar's home for dinner. So our brains look for bad news and store memories of those bad events in the hippocampus. What this does is it enables an effective response to the next similar dangerous experience. So the more challenges that a young person has faced, the more the memories in their hippocampus and their neural pathways are focused on the bad. When anyone but a student has had a long history of a negative past, that can impact their current reaction. Past experiences can trigger responses based on the memories of the past adversities. If they have stored a lot of past bad memories, this can influence their reaction to a current situation. They may trigger and overreact to a situation that from anyone else's perspective is not that significant because of their experience of past adversities. This is like the return military person who triggers upon hearing a loud sound that reflects back to the sounds of war and battle. And this is likely highly implicated in situations where a student becomes disruptive of the learning environment. The impact of trauma on students is they have greater difficulty paying attention and learning. They are greater isolation. They have more negative interactions with school resource officers. They're the primary source of substantial disruptions in the classroom. They have a higher referral to special education, more suspensions and expulsions, and more absences, and more likely to drop out, and more time spent out of class, failing grades, and poor test scores. So if we want to address these issues, we have to focus on addressing the concerns of trauma that are causing these problems. It's also important to focus on the impact of trauma may have on parents. They may have difficulty regulating their emotions when communicating with staff. They likely have increased risk for substance abuse or mental illness, difficulties in forming positive relationships with staff or other parents. This can lead to feelings of shame or guilt about their child's behavior. They may have poor parenting skills, have trouble managing distress, and have greater difficulty helping their child. Staff may also have experienced trauma, and the impact of that trauma is increased anxiety, chronic exhaustion, reduced energy and focus, depression. They may have trouble regulating their emotions, or difficulties managing their responses to students, difficulties managing positive teacher-student relationships, difficulties maintaining positive teacher-parent relationships, and difficulties maintaining positive peer relationships, along with poor attendance or work performance. And what is the impact of trauma on schools? In a highly traumatic environment, students are more likely to engage in substantial disruptions. There are greater challenges in school safety, lower test scores, a negative school climate, increased risk for violence, and weapons on campus. Adults are more reactive and controlling. There's a high absenteeism rate, higher levels of racism and homophobia, a lower graduation rate, a higher rate of suspensions and expulsions, high levels of peer conflict, and a high rate of bullying and harassment. Very helpful insight has come from a study conducted by the CDC and many subsequent studies that focus on adverse childhood experiences. The first adverse childhood experience study was conducted in 1995, or reported in 1995, and assessed the impact of child adversity on later outcomes. There were 17,000 participants. They were largely white, well-educated, employed, middle class, and that is exceptionally important to pay attention to. Their finding was that the more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that the person had experienced, the greater the chance of dramatically increased risks of mental and physical health outcomes. So they looked at these categories: abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual; neglect, physical or emotional; and household dysfunction, mental illness, incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, or divorce. And they looked at these outcomes: behavioral, lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, and missing work; and physical and mental health measurements: obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. And what they found was that with every increase in one of those ACEs, those adverse experiences, was an increase in the negative health and well-being outcomes. Now, what we must pay attention to is the implicit bias that was part of this study. Yes, there were 17,000 participants who were white, well-educated, employed, middle class. And they focused on home-based adversities, that which occurred within the home, ignoring the trauma and adversities of many people, especially people of color, LGBTQ+, religious minorities, and others experience both in school and in society. And it's really, I think, an evidence of implicit bias to continue to rely on an ACE inventory based on the original ACEs, those home-based adversities. That demonstrates continued implicit bias and failure to recognize the trauma and adversities of many of our more marginalized community members and students. Other studies have found a higher prevalence of ACEs in people who are racially marginalized, identify as LGBTQ or binary in some other way, have disabilities, or have not graduated high school, are unemployed or unable to work, are in lower income brackets, or are involved in the justice system. And those other adversities include racism, sexism, homophobia, deportations or threats thereof, poverty, food and housing insecurity, interpersonal and community violence, bullying, death of a family member, and juvenile justice system involvement. So, back to the ACE path. It has been found that the adverse childhood experiences lead to disrupted neural development, which results in social, emotional, and cognitive impairment and the adoption of health risk behaviors, which has an impact on life potential, leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and results in early death. But this does not have to be. We have to focus on stopping the adverse experiences, prevention, and increasing resilience, empowerment, and post-traumatic growth. It's also imperative that we focus on the impact of intergenerational trauma. Children of trauma survivors have higher levels of the evidence of the experience of trauma, even if they did not experience trauma in their lifetime. Children born to parents with high ACE scores are more likely to have neuropsychiatric, behavioral, physical health problems, including sleep sleep disturbances, anxiety, depression, ADHD, asthma, autism, schizophrenia, and PTSD, among others. And there's a very excellent chapter in the ACE Awares document from California, the roadmap for resilience. Very excellent chapter on intergenerational trauma, the best I have found. There appear to be three primary transmission mechanisms. First of all is pregnancy health. Pregnancy and infant health depends on maternal health. So the ability to conceive, pregnancy loss, preterm birth, low birth rate are all related to the mother's experience of trauma. Also, there has been shown to be an unhealthy stress response of infants after birth that relates to maternal trauma. The second issue is epigenetics, the science of gene expression. Now, this could be an entire lecture, so briefly, we've got nature and nurture. So nature is the DNA, and that's basically permanent, but nurture is how genes are expressed, and that can change. Children of trauma survivors show changes in their genes that are associated with traumatic distress and depression. And lastly, there's the impact on parenting, the fear-based survival messages that are transmitted by parents. Don't ask for help. It's dangerous to show signs of weakness. The messages that parents provide to their children related to the dangers that they will encounter in the world impacts how their child experiences the world. We also have to focus on the systemic racial trauma in schools. Again, unconscious bias, unequal funding of schools, racially biased tests, discriminatory harassment by students or staff, a dominant culture version of history, discriminatory school discipline, white supremacy acts by students or staff, school resource officer violence against racial minorities, limitations on educational advancement, the school-to-prison pipeline, and offensive team names. There have been studies of Holocaust families, which found 4 types of parents. The victim parent, who had difficulty moving on from the original trauma, the avoider parent, numb, emotionally detached, intolerant of weakness, and silent, the fighter parent, who continued to engage in the battle, and the survivor parent, who moved beyond the trauma. They also found 4 characteristics of the offspring: those who were overly protective, especially of their parents, those who were highly controlling, that had a high need to maintain control in their lives, those who were obsessed with the original trauma stories, and those who were dependent, immature dependency. Now, I'm reporting on the research. I suspect also there's a 5th characteristic of those offspring who became leaders in social justice. These 3 researchers have contributed greatly to an understanding of the American Indian Holocaust, the historical, totally outrageous treatment of non-Hispanic Native American people. Non-Hispanic Native American adults are at greater risk of experiencing feelings of psychological distress, and they're more likely to have poor overall physical and mental health and unmet medical and psychological needs. As was stated, the current problems facing Native American people I would change that to clearly is the result of a legacy of chronic trauma and unresolved grief over generations enacted on them by the European dominant culture. These researchers have outlined 3 phases of the experience of trauma. First phase, trauma was inflicted. The dominant culture perpetuated massive traumas on the population, resulting in cultural, familial, societal, and economic devastation. The original generation responded to the trauma showing biological, societal, and psychological symptoms. And then the trauma has been conveyed. The responses to trauma are conveyed to successive generations through environmental and psychological factors, as well as the ongoing prejudice and discrimination they experience. Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma by Kenneth Hardy is very helpful work. As he states, racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. He speaks of these 4 hidden wounds. Internalized evaluation. I am bad, unworthy. The assaulted sense of self. I am not. Intelligent, welcome, able to succeed. Internalized voicelessness. I ain't stupid. I know I cannot speak out. And the wound of rage. Deep-seated, hidden wounds from long-lasting denigration. These are some continuing concerns that were identified for me by my friend Johnny Lake, who is a marvelous source of insight and wisdom in these areas. The impact of recent events on Black people, constant anxiety and fear 24/7, remembering distressing stories and lessons they've learned from their elders, fear of attack in public places, an intense fear of police, memories of bad experiences that are coming to their present attention, intense feelings of anger and display, increased fear due to an increase in hateful actions of white supremacists, fears that someone will shoot them, run them over, or call the police on them, who will kill them. We have to consider the experiences of trauma among the Latino population. Now, Latinos are the fastest growing population in the United States, and they are not a monolithic community. There are many different places from which those who are considered Latinos come from. Latinos tend, however, to have very strong extended family structures, a respect for authority, and a devotion to spiritual practices. There has been significant diversity in their experiences. Some have been in the U.S. for generations, while others are recent immigrants. Most are here legally, while others are not. Many fled violence in their homelands and had profound, multiple traumatic experiences in their homelands. U.S. children of undocumented parents have an ever-present fear that their parents will be deported. And in the U.S., Latinos suffer discrimination, poor housing, low-paying jobs, and inadequate education opportunities. Salud America provides excellent insight as well as resources. They have identified that nearly 80% of Latino youth have suffered childhood trauma. 28% of youth have suffered 4 or more experiences of adverse trauma. 22% of Latino youth have depressive symptoms, which is a rate higher than any other minority group other than Native American youth. More than 1 in 4 Latino high schoolers have considered suicide. Latino high schoolers are more likely to attempt suicide than their white peers. A greater percentage of them say they feel hopeless and sad and participate less in doing the things they enjoy as a result. Depression among U.S.-born Latino high school schoolers is significantly associated with discrimination by teachers and students, and a large percentage of Latino students report being bullied at schools, which has negative emotional and physical health effects. There are also intergenerational trauma concerns with those who experienced, or the offspring of those who experienced, the internment of the Japanese during World War II. Remember, President Roosevelt authorized the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry, that's 120,000 Japanese Americans, who were ordered to leave their homes and live in remote incarceration camps. This is an interesting pattern. Apparently, there was significant family avoidance, and parents had this conspiracy of silence. And the key response was a suppression of Japanese cultural identity and an attempt to blend in. As you recall, fawn is one of the four responses to trauma. So it appears to have been an inherited need to become a super American, downplay their Japanese identity, not rock the boat, that's fawn, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves and to prove their worth to society through high achievement and hard work, which can lead to significant anxiety. The trauma associated with refugees can be either direct trauma of the children or intergenerational trauma, depending on when they came or what has been experienced. Many refugees, especially children, have experienced trauma related to war, persecution, and this very certainly has affected their mental and physical health long after these events have occurred. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a set of very excellent resources to address refugee trauma. Refugee children may feel relieved when they're resettled in the U.S., but the difficulties they face will continue. What they have experienced can be called traumatic events. It's very important when assessing trauma and their symptoms that providers pay attention to cultural considerations and that those guide the steps. Refugee children and adolescents apparently exhibit resilience despite a history of the trauma. However, that trauma can impact the child's emotional and behavioral development. Other youth may experience traumas related to their identity. This includes LGBTQ plus youth, youth who are neurodiverse or have disabilities, and youth who are obese or overweight. These three groups of students are most frequently bullied because they are considered to be different. Let's consider the traumatic experiences of our LGBTQ binary youth. The Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network routinely conducts these national school climate surveys. In the last school climate survey, they found that 59% of LGBTQ students felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation, 43% because of their gender expression, and 37% because of their gender. 33% missed at least one entire day of school in the past month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. And 9% missed 4 or more days in the past month. Many youth avoided gender segregated places at school because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. And that includes bathrooms or locker rooms. Most reported avoiding school functions and extracurricular activities because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. And nearly a fifth have changed schools because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. Let's also consider how experiencing trauma may be associated with being considered disabled. Now, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there is the concept of students who suffer from an emotional disturbance. This is defined as an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual or health factors, an inability to create satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, and behavior demonstrated over a long period of time and to such a degree that it interferes with a student's ability to function at school. As this researcher has identified, we need to have a trauma-informed approach to behavior disorders in special education. Students who are diagnosed as emotionally disturbed perform the poorest of all students in special education, although they have no cognitive deficits. More than 2 out of 5 students with emotional or behavior disorders leave high school before graduating, And 4 years after high school, nearly 3 out of 5 have been arrested. How many of these young people are young people who have experienced trauma that has not been effectively identified or addressed? Many students who are said to have an emotional disturbance or are behavior distorted have experienced trauma at home, in the community, or at school. This has resulted in their lack of focus, their struggles to self-regulate, their struggles with emotional regulation, their impulsivity, slow processing, the fact that they are disruptive and lack executive functioning and have sensory problems. Should this be considered a child with a behavior disorder, essentially that something is wrong with them, or should this be considered a child to whom some very wrong things have happened? So I used to teach these kinds of students, and I really, every single one of them had or were continuing to experience trauma. How many students who are classified as having an emotional disturbance or are considered to be behavior disordered have experienced trauma? Does your school know? Does your school investigate the potential of trauma in any situation where a student is experiencing behavior challenges? Does your school implement a trauma-informed approach to address such concerns? What about the potential trauma implications of those young people who are neurodiverse? Should neurological differences be considered a disability? Are students who are neurodiverse expected to modify their behaviors to fit into the normal school environment? What are the traumas associated with the expectation that you will be able to manage your behaviors in accord with certain expectations when your brain simply doesn't function in this way? Has your school implemented a trauma-informed approach to address
The Obesity
these concerns?
Action Coalition provided this helpful information on bullying and childhood obesity. I do not like use of the term bully side, but that's the title of their article. They found that in a national survey of overweight sixth graders, 24% of the boys and 30% of the girls experience daily, focus on daily, teasing, bullying, or rejection because of their size, and that number doubled for overweight high school students, with 58% of boys and 63% of girls experiencing daily teasing, bullying, or rejection because of their size.
We also need to consider the traumatic impact of COVID-19. This is a very helpful article, The Impact of COVID-19 and Lockdown on the Mental Health of Children and Adolescents. In this article, they stated, these inexorable circumstances, which are beyond normal, lead to stress, anxiety, and a feeling of helplessness in all. It has been indicated that compared to adults, this pandemic may continue to have increased long-term adverse consequences for children and adolescents. And the nature and extent of this impact on this age group depends on many vulnerability factors, such as their developmental age, current education status, whether they have special needs, pre-existing mental health conditions, are economically underprivileged, and the parent-child being quarantined due to infection or fear of infection. It's also necessary to toss into this analysis the impact of COVID-19 on disadvantaged families, and this includes disadvantaged white families. Considered essential workers and forced to work in unsafe conditions, they had no social power to protest against these unsafe conditions. Shamed and blamed of their community by media, institutions, and the government. Higher death rates. The urban density increased risks. Multi-generational housing raised risk for family members. There was increased unemployment. Many of these families had no financial reserves. threats of homelessness and evictions, loss of elders, financial insecurity, food insecurity, and less access to medical care. And there is the potential of trauma with return to school. Some students will feel that they are behind and will feel that they are being blamed for being behind. Many students who are normally bullied were actually reportedly enjoying remote learning because the bullying largely went away. And upon return to school, they will feel helpless and hopeless because the bullying is very likely to return. Also, many students who are neurodiverse reportedly experienced significant success in remote instruction because they were able to arrange their environment to more effectively support their needs. And upon return to school, they will be in a climate that may not support them. So, what supports resilience? There are 5 factors that are most supportive of resilience. The first and really important one is supportive relationships. Having at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. Self-regulation, opportunities to strengthen their adaptive skills and their self-regulatory capacities. Self-efficacy, their sense of self-efficacy and perceived control over their environment. Manageable threats, learning to cope with manageable threats. And hope, sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. As I indicated, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University has excellent resources on resilience. This is a statement from them. Adversity is inevitable. Learning how to cope with adversity is an important part of healthy child development. When a child experiences an adversity within an environment of supportive relationships, the effects subside. However, if the adversity is extreme or long-lasting and supportive relationships are not available, the results can be damaging with a lifelong harmful impact. It's also important to recognize that our brains can change. This is a process called neuroplasticity. The neurons in the brain can rewire themselves, and this allows anyone who's experienced challenges to achieve resilience and empowerment. It is said that it takes 5 positives to undo 1 negative neural synapse. There is also research in post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is the positive change that results from having experienced more significant challenges. This includes an increased sense of personal strength, new opportunities, closer relationships, greater appreciation of life, deepening of spiritual life, and engagement in a quest for social justice.
I created this slide originally in April, and this sets forth what I hope can be positive change as a growth coming out of the post-COVID-19 trauma. An increased sense of personal strength of all members within the school community, deepening of commitment to the well-being of all members, closer relationships between all members of the school community, new opportunities and strategies to support students in achieving success, and a solid commitment to social justice. And I'm seeing many indications of positive school work in this area. I am seeing these signs. But also, unfortunately, there are clear signs of a battle that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. We've got funding coming from those who have been seeking to destroy public schools for a long time, clear intents to brand the term critical race theory as evil and apply this evil branding to everything schools are doing to achieve greater equity. There are even objections to district statements of commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. And in too many states, there have been restrictions enacted on teaching an accurate understanding of history. So we have to really consider, how is this going to impact students, especially those who have experienced intergenerational trauma. I strongly encourage you to pay very close attention to the well-being, especially of BIPOC and LGBTQ students who have universally experienced discrimination and trauma in their schools and who are under significant attack at this point in time. The BIPOC students have also experienced intergenerational trauma. These current events, I believe, are highly likely to trigger a post-traumatic response, including also more significant responses to less significant individual events. We've got organizations calling for parents to expose the truth about what's going on in schools. And so it's really essential that support for BIPOC and LGBTQ students be done very carefully so as not to generate an exposure that could harm them and everyone else in the district even more. All of the lessons in the next video can help all students to gain greater resilience and empowerment.
Thank you for listening. These are my websites, embracecivility.org and bepositivelypowerful.com, with email at info@embracecivility.org.